in. So I think we're going to get going even as people start to come in, so we can try to keep on schedule. So welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. This is the third webinar of the year for the CALP CVA Climate and Environment of Community Practice. Today we'll be looking at the interrelationships between social protection, CVA, and climate change. Next slide, please, Liana. Okay, hi, I'm Ruth McCormack. I'm a technical advisor with CALP and one of the co-leads of this community of practice. My colleague Celine Sinitsky, who is co-lead as well, she'll be introducing herself a little bit later on, but is co-facilitating with me today. Jerome, that you can see on the screen there as well, will actually be supporting on the Asia-friendly webinar that's happening next week. Okay, next slide, please. All right, before we get going, a few things on housekeeping, the usual. So we're scheduled today for 90 minutes. We're going to try and keep to time. We are recording the webinar. We'll be sharing the recordings of this and the Asia-friendly webinar through the CALP website afterwards, along with other supporting documentation. For attendees, so you are in webinar mode, which means that obviously you don't have the ability to sort of talk on here, but you can participate in the chat. So please do introduce yourself. You can use the chat also if you've got any reflections, if there are resources that you want to share. Sorry, we don't, and apologies that we don't have live translation for this event. Unfortunately, we don't have the resources to do that. We have got the PowerPoint slides translated into French and Spanish, and I think Celine will be sharing those if she hasn't already. So if you have got French or Spanish as your sort of your main language and would like to try and follow with that, then that's one way of supporting, kind of getting around some of our limitations on the translation. Next slide, please. So as I pointed out, in terms of interactions, obviously we welcome your input today. Do introduce yourself in the chat box. If you've got questions, though, please try and use the Q&A box. We'll be keeping a track on those, so we might try and answer some of those in real time if ourselves or any of the panelists sort of have a response that they want to provide live. And so far as time allows, we'll see if we can incorporate some of those questions into the panel discussion. And if we're not able to get through those today, then we'll certainly attempt to pull together some responses and circulate them after the event. Okay, very much. Next slide. So agenda for today, at the moment we're doing the welcome. We're going to have a few presentations to start with, just to help us set the scene and understand some of the fundamentals around social protection, climate change, and the linkages with humanitarian CVA. And then we'll proceed to a panel discussion. So we're hoping that we should get, around 45, 50 minutes for the panel discussion before we conclude. Okay, next slide, please. So briefly, our all-star panelists and presenters today, we'll introduce them in more detail as we proceed, but just briefly, we have Anna McCord, Sayanti Sengupta, Matthew Walsham, Elisa Savelli, and Annalisa Staffer. So Anna and Sayanti and Matthew will be presenting. Elisa and Annalisa will be on the panel, and our presenters will also be participating in the panel discussion. Next slide, please. Okay, so to begin, just very briefly, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the findings from the State of the World's Cash Report. We've used the findings from the State of the World's Cash Report really as our sort of inspiration as we've relaunched this community of practice, because we had a dedicated chapter. So next slide, please. for the first time on the interrelations between climate and environment crisis and CVA. So what we tried to do in that chapter was really sort of develop a bit of a framework for analysing the different ways in which CVA could or is being used sort of throughout the disaster response cycle. Next slide, please. Okay, so one of the things we found that clearly climate change requires strategies that not only aim to reduce the frequency and severity of associated shocks and to relieve humanitarian needs, but critically also to enable people and communities to better adapt to, manage and recover from the impact of events when they occur. So critically, when we're looking at the role of social protection here, that we've got there a mechanism that has the potential to address multiple vulnerabilities associated with climate change and environmental degradation. So for example, the report highlights adaptive social protection, which is obviously a type of programming that's been building in terms of the volume and focus in recent years, and that really aims to build the capacity of poor households to prepare for, cope with and adapt to shocks and avoid falling further into poverty. So within that we see that, for example, it's highlighted if you use existing social registry data but without kind of layering in climate vulnerability, then that has the potential to kind of aggravate exclusion errors and obviously sort of it reduces the effectiveness overall. Next slide, please. Another area that came out quite strongly was there that we see that the potential for leveraging social protection systems to institutionalise anticipatory action is increasingly well documented, although so far hasn't been operationalised at scale. So we can see, for example, that the evidence indicates that kind of a one-off anticipatory transfer cannot fully facilitate a quick recovery, so that further transfers may be required, which sort of tends to point to the need for longer-term interventions. But we can see overall that there's kind of clear interplay between humanitarian CVA, anticipatory and forecast-based actions, and social protection that is likely to be really critical for these as things move forward. Another area that came out in terms of the research was around adaptation and resilience, that we know that these are longer term processes, that they've got a critical role to play in terms of social protection. On one hand, where there's kind of quite a bit of evidence that longer term provision of cash transfers can increase the coping capacity of households to kind of deal with climate extremes. We've got less evidence about the impacts of short-term cash assistance in terms of resilience. And there's indications, obviously, that those short-term interventions are not enough to deal with complex climate crises, and again, indicating that need for a longer-term intervention. Cash for work came up as well. Cash for work or public works as having a role to play in supporting risk reduction and building environmental resilience. I know this is something that Matthew will look at in his presentation. And while those kind of interventions kind of based on resilience building tend to typically fall more within the scope of development and social protection, cash for work is well established within humanitarian response. So there is, the potential for a kind of a bridging function there to longer term initiatives. So one of the things that then came out as well as a kind of topic for future debate was if and how far CVA can be designed to support and link to longer term holistic approaches to address climate change. And to do that really requires having a joined up approach, working beyond the usual boundaries and partnerships of humanitarian response, including recognising the central role of governments and obviously that relationship between CVA and pro-climate social protection. Which brings us then to sort of the overarching question that we're hoping to explore in today's webinar, which is how might social protection use CVA to provide more effective and coherent support to populations in managing, adapting to and recovering from the impacts of the climate and environmental crisis. I don't expect we'll come up with all the answers to that today, but I know that we'll be able to have some very interesting discussions and start to consider some of the key elements. So to do that, we're going to start with some presentations that are going to outline some of the likely impacts of climate change on social protection, exploring then kind of its role and function in helping to address those impacts, and then looking a little bit more in detail at some of the linkages between humanitarian response and social protection, and to CVA, and then onto climate adaptation. And after that, we will go into our panel discussion. So our first presentation, next slide, please, will be with Anna McCord. Welcome, Anna. Anna has 30 years of experience in international development, working on social protection for the last 20 years. She has a PhD in economics and worked in humanitarian response in the 90s before moving into policy, and has worked as an academic, an economic advisor with FCDO, and also worked with ODI's social protection team before becoming an independent consultant. She's worked on multiple aspects of social protection, including financing, shock responsive social protection, systems development, and is currently focusing on the implications of climate change for social protection systems and development. She leads the Climate Change and Social Protection Research Initiative and is currently working for the European Union, FCDO, DFAT, FAO and GIZ on how social protection can be used to respond to climate challenges. So I think she is brilliantly well placed to take us through some of the key impacts of climate change on social protection. So over to you, Anna. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah, thank you ever so much for this invitation, Ruth and Celine. I'm really grateful to have this opportunity to share with you some of the findings from research I've been doing over the last couple of years, looking at the implications of climate change for social protection. What I'd like to do is really contextualize the debate that will happen subsequently, because I think Matthew and Shanti are going to be presenting more examples. So I just want to locate this discussion in the current social protection and climate discourse. So as an opener, I'd just like to say that actually we're all seeing widespread negative impacts already taking place as a result of climate change. And these impacts are going to intensify under even the most optimistic warming scenarios because of the implications of the emissions which have already taken place. So what we're seeing is that there's going to be a growth in multiple compounding shocks and stresses, which is going to drive really quite significant social, economic, and political disruption. And this is going to have implications for the structure of national economies and labour markets, for health, for access to basic resources, for sustainable livelihoods, and really have quite significant disrupting effects globally, damaging critical economic sectors and livelihoods and limiting GDP growth. So I think when we talk about climate change, it's useful to think beyond just the shocks that we might sometimes see, and actually think of it as, in the medium term, as really profoundly reshaping the kind of socioeconomic risks that people face and extending poverty and vulnerability. So the future is likely to look very different from the present in terms of the kind of challenges that we're trying to respond to. Next slide, please. Oh, and I should have said these findings come from the latest IPCC report, which was published in 2022. And I think it's quite useful. I'm sorry there's a lot of text here, but I think it's quite a nice summary of the way that climate is going to impact. What we'll see is a series of biophysical climate drivers, the changes in extreme weather events, the kind of classic shocks that we tend to think about, flooding, storm surges. Also, there'll be these changes in climatological systems with increases in temperature, changes in precipitation, sea level rise, and also changes in terrestrial and marine ecosystems with reduced resource availability, decreased biodiversity, these kind of things. And these factors will impact on human systems, and they'll change the way that existing drivers of poverty and vulnerability function. So they'll interact with population growth, patterns of economic growth, politics, institutional factors, And they'll also interact with the kind of environmental degradation with pollution and ecosystems overexploitation that we're seeing, and also with conflict. So these biophysical climate factors will feed into existing drivers of poverty and vulnerability. And the impacts are going to be felt, I think, across a range of human systems. And again, this is based on the research that I carried out, which summarized the findings of the IPCC. We're going to be seeing really major issues of food and water security, with increased water scarcity, significantly decreasing yields, areas where production is no longer possible, reduced food security. We're going to see impacts on infrastructure with loss and damage to physical infrastructure, disruptions to energy generation as hydropower is disturbed, as rivers dry up and can no longer be used for cooling electricity production or nuclear production, a whole range of infrastructure impacts. I won't go through all the detail, but we'll see impacts on urban settlements with inundation of coastal cities, growth of informal settlements. We'll see changes in the structure of the economy, significant changes in terms of internal transboundary migration, competition for scarce resources. And what we're going to be seeing also is that in some instances, there are going to be major economic and labour market effects as people find that they're reaching the limits to adaptation. We'll see the loss of livelihoods, reduction in some areas of employment. Equally, we're going to be seeing health and nutrition changes with increased incidence of various illnesses, increased vector-borne diseases, heat stress. And all of this is going to add up to quite a significant change in terms of the poverty context. I'm sorry that's rather depressing, but I think it's really useful, because if we think of climate change in this way, we go beyond looking at shocks and stresses and we see this broader set of challenges. Next slide, please. So what does this actually mean? Well, I think it's useful to put a few numbers onto this. The World Bank estimate that this is going to mean an extra 130 million people in extreme poverty by 2030, significant increases in internal displacement globally, and up to 100 million in Africa alone. It's going to have major impacts on the global economy, and some recent research from the Potsdam Institute suggested that global damages will add up to 38 trillion per annum by 2050. And there are likely to be market failures and threats to existing business models, challenges to the insurance industry. All of these kind of things will be affected also by climate. So what that means is that we have an increased certainty of shocks and stresses. We know there are going to be increased humanitarian challenges and also an increase in the chronic need for social protection. But I think the other interesting issue which comes out of the climate sector is that we're facing a situation of deep uncertainty. We don't know exactly what the future scenarios will be. We don't know exactly what the timeframes will be, because we're facing a situation where there are tipping points, domino effects, compounding effects. And so we can't say exactly what the challenge will be. We have to be able to cope with uncertainty in our programming. Next slide, please. And this is a graph we put together which tries to sort of sum up the challenge that we're facing in terms of poverty and need for social protection. And what you have here is this increase. The red line is your emergencies, your crises. So what you see is an increasing frequency and an impact of your humanitarian needs, of your crises over time. There are more crises, they're more severe. But at the same time, you have an ongoing growth of chronic needs for social protection as more and more people lose their livelihoods. And this underlying chronic need for social protection is likely to jump at certain periods. It won't be a gradual incremental change, it will jump as we reach these tipping points. So I think it's important to realize we're not just talking about the worsening incidence of crises and shocks, but we're also looking at this long-term growth in need as people need increased income support to help them to meet their basic needs. Next slide, please. What does this mean for the social protection needs? What does this change mean? Well, it means that we need to think about the scale of provision. There's going to be a significant need for an increase in scale. We need to think about the type of instruments we use. what's most appropriate. We need to think about the duration of needs. As I said, it won't just be these chronic spikes, these acute spikes in need. We'll have a chronic increase in need. And we also need to think about the spatial distribution of need. Next slide, please. I'm going to go through this rapidly because I think I just have a minute or two left, and I know I'm trying to cover a lot of material. But let me just share with you what I mean when I say we need to think about these 4 areas of impact. In terms of scale, we're going to have a large increase in the number of people globally who cannot meet their basic needs without external support. That's one issue. So we need to think about increasing the scale of provision. Second issue is the type of support we offer. These changing risks as people reach the limits to adaptation, labour markets are disrupted, food becomes scarce. We have to think what kind of instruments are appropriate in this context. How might we have to adapt CVA responses or other types of responses to be more appropriate? Equally, the duration, how do we respond to shocks which aren't necessarily short-term? They won't resolve in the short term, but they'll lead to ongoing protracted crises. And finally, we need to think about changes in the spatial distribution of needs because of issues such as urban socioeconomic and infrastructure disruption may drive people out of certain urban areas. Equally, others may be pulled into urban areas. We need to think about the deindustrialization that might happen as a result of the just green transition. And we also need to think about issues to do with domestic displacement and cross-border displacement. So we need programming which can accommodate these kind of changing geographic focuses. Next slide, please. Okay, let me just run through the challenges that we're facing in the sector. And I think the reality is that at the moment, we have quite limited coverage and weak operational systems in many of the countries which are going to be most affected by climate change. And in low and middle income countries, social protection coverage is only about 14%. So actually, if we're talking about using social protection systems as a basis for this kind of response, we actually have quite weak systems currently. And I think it's fair to say there are a range of policy and programme initiatives which are trying to link social protection and climate change, including the adaptive social protection that Ruth mentioned, and also shock responsive social protection. But to date, there are few large-scale national programmes, and most aren't aligned to national climate strategies. We still have limited systematic humanitarian and social protection systems integration. It's happening on an ad hoc basis, but we don't have these 2 responses integrated. And I think given the scarcity of resources that we're likely to face and the kind of growth of the challenge, we need to think more about efficiencies and really strategic harmonisation across these 2 areas between social protection and humanitarian. Because in fact, we're looking at sectors which are very resource constrained. The ILO has just estimated that an additional 1.4 trillion will be required annually to meet basic social provision needs. So that's without adding climate change. At the moment, there's a shortfall in countries' ability to meet the basic needs of their citizens. And then if we look at the humanitarian sector, there's a similar kind of funding challenge. I think last year, only 35% of global humanitarian requirements were funded. So we're facing a real challenge. Resources aren't there, and resources are likely to become more scarce. Aid resources are likely to become more scarce in the future. So we really need to be thinking about efficiencies. Next slide, please. Okay, this is the last piece of contextual information I wanted to share with you, because the question is, what role can social protection play in this context? Supposing we can finance social protection, how could it be used to address climate challenges? And I think there's maybe 5 broad areas where social protection could be used. And I know these are going to be explored more by Shanti and Matthew. So I'll just give you the headlines. The first area where social protection can play a role is reducing underlying vulnerability to climate change. That's by directly reducing income poverty, contributing to human development. The second is responding to climate shocks and disasters, exactly what much of current CVA work is designed to do, transferring income to cushion the effects of shocks and stresses. The third is offsetting the negative welfare impacts of climate transition policies. Now, this is probably something that isn't very familiar to those of you working in the humanitarian sector, but introducing the kind of climate policies that are necessary to to reduce carbon emissions will entail shifting the nature of industry, closing down some industry. It will entail carbon pricing, which will increase the price of goods and services, which has a particularly significant effect on poor people. So actually social protection can be used to offset these kind of negative welfare effects. And in fact, imposing subsidy reforms without introducing social protection and cash transfers has actually led to significant conflict in a number of countries in recent years. So it's really critical the two come together. Okay, just two more to go through. The fourth is that, sorry, no, same slide, please. The fourth way that social protection can address climate change is by facilitating and enabling climate change adaptation options. This is things like cash plus, when you have your cash transfer plus some kind of intervention to help people to adapt their livelihoods. And the fifth is that social protection can be used directly to contribute to reduced greenhouse gas emissions, to promote carbon sequestration and ecosystems restoration. And here we're thinking about things like public works programs, which can be designed in such a way that they actually address the causes of the climate problem. I'm going to leave it there. And I hope that wasn't too rapid, but I think what I've tried to do is contextualize the discussion that's going to follow. And you're welcome to ask me questions in the chat, and I'll respond there. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ruth. Shanti, over to you.
Thanks so much, Anna. And yes, sorry you were rushed there a little bit at the end. I know you had a couple of slides that you possibly didn't get to, but we can cover it in the panel discussion. And also, yes, some resources there as well that we will share. Sayanti, I'm just going to introduce you very briefly before we start. So Sayanti Sengupta is an experienced social protection and climate change expert. She works as an independent consultant with several agencies, including the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Centre, UNICEF, WFP, ILO, and the Climate Change and Social Protection Research Initiative, which I work with Anna. Over the last 7 years, she's supported national governments and institutions to strengthen their social protection systems to manage and address climate risks better. She's currently based in Berlin, and having roots from India, she holds 2 master's degrees in analysis and design of social protection systems and in water policy and governance. And her expertise includes designing and implementing social protection policies and programs, conducting feasibility studies, risk and vulnerability assessments, and stress tests for anticipatory social protection systems across Asia and African countries. So I know Santi's going to be looking more specifically at the interplay between social protection and the humanitarian sector. So over to you, Santi.
Thanks, Ruth, and maybe straight into the next slide. Thanks for that introduction. I don't need to introduce myself. I'll just go into the topic itself. As we saw in the beginning, the State of the World's Cash Report has definitely recognized one key message around social protection, and that says social protection systems should be adapted to enhance their role in crisis response. And as we actually make these social protection systems adapted in nature, and by adaptive, I mean social protection systems need to be strengthened to manage the short-term shocks as well as the long-term projected climate risks and uncertainties that Anna was mentioning that we will be dealing with. The humanitarian sector's role will become more and more important in making these systems ready, flexible, stronger, and adaptive. And in my presentation, I just cover a few examples where this is happening in practice. Next slide, please. So the range of options where humanitarian, and this is from the report itself, the range of options where humanitarian action and social protection can be combined or can be brought together is vast, ranging from very weak systems where systems are not existing or very nascent in the left, where parallel humanitarian systems mimicking what social protection priorities in the countries are, but country governments not able to do at the moment. This kind of examples also exist, to going to more mature systems towards the right, where using existing social protection systems, which are quite mature, have interoperable systems in place, have single registries in place, have been leveraged to give humanitarian cash support in the past. During COVID, we have seen that. We've also seen this for several climate shocks in the past, and it's becoming something much more integrated. So there, based on which country is with their social protection system, there might be different options of how humanitarian sector and the social protection sector can come together. And there are some advantages of doing this. Next slide, please. There are different advantages of doing this, but then starting with, it can be very quick. If there is an established social protection system which is scaled up to provide humanitarian support, it is something that can work at very short lead times. We have seen this in some examples. It also builds strength and capacity within the national agencies themselves. The scale at which it can, and the caseloads that it can cater to is massive in some countries where systems have been operating for years. But apart from everything, it can be economic, sustainable, it can be improving coordination, but it's also something that we currently see. It's something that's preferred by donors. More and more donors are wanting to see the integration system strengthening in countries themselves, improving capacities within the national governments themselves. And this can be something that can be related back to the constraint of resources that we see and the need to increase efficiency. Next slide, please. So where this is happening in practice, I have 3 examples that I wanted to share in my short input today. Starting from Nigeria, this is an ECHO-funded project. We have been working with UNICEF and the Red Cross partners. We started with a flood and vulnerability analysis and preparing some hazard risk maps. After the hazard risk maps were prepared, we worked with the National Social Protection Agency at the district level to get information of the beneficiaries who are present in these districts. We kind of overlaid the data along with consultations with the community. We identified who are the most vulnerable in this region. Based on these people, often we found were not part of the social protection registry which they were using because they were vulnerable to the climate shock from flood, but not vulnerable in the sense of poverty targeting that the current program in these districts were doing. So what we created is a waiting list of us, which was supplementary to the social protection database itself. And based on a trigger, when there was a trigger for a forecasted flood, there were 5,000 households which were provided with anticipatory cash transfer. To make this happen within this 3 days lead time before the flood was supposed to happen, we used the same financial service provider which the social protection agencies in the country recommended us to use. So the similar MOU was done between UNICEF and this financial service provider. There was a lot of already community trust established in this process. The community state coordination agency who were responsible for delivering the normal cash transfer were also the ones who were spreading a lot of awareness and communication about this top-up anticipatory cash transfer, which was supposed to happen before the flood actually comes. And the beneficiaries who were identified, who were not initially part of the registry, are now being integrated as part of a rapid response register, which is a subset of the social registry in the country. So in a way, this humanitarian intervention that had happened is now complementing the overall social registry that existed in the country, but did not include these climate vulnerable people. So this was one of the first examples I wanted to speak about. The next one, next slide, please, is an example of the National Safety Net Program Baxnano from Somalia, which supports households in preventing some of their negative coping mechanisms to meet the rising needs caused by recurrent shocks. And what has happened in this program, it has provided a very quick scale up of the program, which resulted in additional vulnerable households to receive a short-term cash transfer. So in this way, the National Social Protection System itself, so the previous example I showed, it was a separate UNICEF Red Cross intervention. However, in this one, in the National Safety Net Program, there is a component of shock responsiveness added, and it gives predictable cash transfers every time there's and the funding is coming from WFP at the moment. And the WFP is working with the federal government of Somalia through the Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs. And this predictable cash transfers are given every time there is a drought trigger, for instance, being reached. This is supposed to help some of the consumption, help cope with some of the consumption needs that will happen during the drought periods, for instance. Next slide, please. And the final example I wanted to present was from Nepal. Nepal has this huge social security allowance program which targets lots of disadvantaged groups throughout the country. For a long time, there was a lot of resistance in giving cash directly to the people in this country. But after a 1 year long, actually it was 2 years project, but 1 year of community trainings and so on, we worked with the communities to explain the concept. And by community, I mean the communities themselves, as well as the provincial district heads and so on, to discuss how we can combine anticipatory action, how we can combine humanitarian action and social protection. And what we did was we got the permission from the social security allowance program at the national level to use the same bank accounts which they use for regular cash transfers to give digital cash quickly as soon as there was a flood trigger that was reached. After the study, when we saw that there was also quite a bit of good impacts and negative coping mechanisms that were previously used by communities not used this time, the district and the municipal governments themselves decided to give a part of their emergency budget, annual emergency budget, to do a similar cash transfer intervention in anticipation when the next flood trigger was reached. So initially, the first money came from DREF, which is the Red Cross emergency funding that's given. But once we had kind of demonstrated that this works, they themselves allocated some of their emergency budget to do this kind of action the next time a flood trigger was reached. So this was my last example. Going on to the next slide. So there are different ways where humanitarian actors are coming together. But apart from the generic coordination and dissemination, there's also working groups being set up in the Asia Pacific region, in the African region, where humanitarian actors and social protection actors are coordinating in terms of transfer levels, in terms of targeting strategies, in terms of eligibility and selection criteria to ensure that they are targeting different regions and so on. And also sharing data and coming up with MOUs, which are very much the foundational block to make sure that you can work together and work in different regions without overlaps and target the ones that needs to be targeted. So I will stop there, and I can see some questions already coming up in the chat, and I'm going to answer them in the chat. Thanks for that opportunity, and I think Matthew will cover the next slides on how this is happening in practice. Over to you, Ruth.
Thanks, Sandy. Thanks so much, and for keeping on time. Brilliant. So let's move straight on to Matthew's presentation. I'll just introduce him first. So Matthew Walsham works for FAO's social protection team, focusing on the role of social protection in inclusive climate action. He's worked as a consultant on social protection for a range of organisations and was based for several years in Cambodia and Bangladesh. This included working on a major evidence gathering exercise on climate change and migration for IOM in Bangladesh. Matthew has a PhD in development policy and planning from the Global Development Institute at the University of Manchester, and previously worked as a research fellow in social protection at the International Centre for Evidence in Disability at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. I'll leave it there and hand over to you, Matthew. Thanks very much.
I can't seem to switch my video on. I think I need you to do that for me. But
we can hear you. We can hear you loud and clear, though. So.
Oh, perfect. I'll get started. So, thanks very much for that introduction, and thanks very much for inviting me to this event. I think it's really interesting to be able to present really on the kind of adaptation agenda and the links then to CVA, but also more broadly to shock responsive social protection. There we go, my video is on. And also to be able to follow Anna's excellent kind of contextualization and some of the examples that Shanti's given with really a kind of humanitarian flavor to it. So I'm going to speak more specifically to the social protection kind of sector angle. Next slide, please. We go to the next slide, yeah. So yeah, I just think Anna's gave a great context in terms of the increasing needs and also the importance of a long-term perspective in relation to how we address those needs. Then also this kind of idea of the 5 different functions in which social protection can play a role in relation to climate. I would add maybe to that also to think about it from the climate action perspective, that really social protection has a key role to play in making climate action more socially inclusive. So we know at the moment there's a real struggle, if you take a kind of climate perspective, for getting climate finance, getting the kinds of programs that are being put in place to really reach the poorest and most vulnerable. So from the FAO perspective, only 1.7% of existing climate finance reaches small-scale farmers, who we know are on the front line of climate change. And so the underlying kind of principle here is that social protection can be a part of the solution to help make social protection to help make climate action both more inclusive and more resilient. Next slide, please. So I'll be giving a few examples. I have to be fairly brief, I don't have that much time. And you can dig down a little bit more into detail in some of these reports that I'm flagging up here. So we conducted recently a scoping review on the role of social protection in climate change adaptation. Colleagues have done work on social protection and anticipatory action, and more broadly on shock responsive social protection. There's also an e-course that I think will be shared in the chat on managing climate risks through social protection that's available in English and French, and soon to be available in Spanish. But just to say that we have existing evidence about the role that social protection is already playing in relation to absorbing of climate shocks, promoting climate adaptation, contributing, as Anna said, to climate change mitigation directly. So this is, for example, through public works programs that are helping to restore ecosystems or reforest areas, as well as really critically easing the socioeconomic impacts of climate mitigation policies. So where, for example, you might see the withdrawal of fuel subsidies. Now, in this presentation, I'll be speaking mostly to the first 2 points here, but I think it's important to keep the other areas in mind. As Anna said, public works programs in particular are having demonstrable impacts on climate mitigation, and it's good to keep that element in mind. But I'll focus most specifically on the links between shock responsive social protection and climate adaptation. And as I said, throughout this, thinking about how social protection can help to make climate action more inclusive and ensure it reaches the poorest. Okay, next slide. So yeah, I'm just going to give a small number of examples now. I think Shanti gave some really excellent sort of on-the-ground examples of the way in which the humanitarian sector is working with governments to really bring together the CVA agenda, the shock responsive social protection and anticipatory action agenda, and government action. The examples I'm going to give right now are all government programs. But I mean, I think it's really important to think about how, as we've said in the introductory slides, how we link these 2 agendas going forward. So the Hunger Safety Net program in Kenya, which is a really good example, an unconditional cash transfer that can be scaled up before, during, and after shocks. That we know there's very good evidence that it has really important impacts on sustaining consumption, reducing the liquidation of assets, and responding directly to climate shocks. Now, this was not designed initially as a climate program, but it's increasingly becoming one. I mean, I think it's really interesting, but one area that it lacks at the moment is that explicit link to climate adaptation. So it's a cash transfer without a kind of plus component as delivered at the moment. And I think all 3 examples I'm going to give probably have missing elements that we need to think about as we go forward. So next slide, please. So the second example is the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme in India. So here we've got a public works program, again, not introduced as specifically a program in relation to climate risks. So more focused on the well-established agricultural lean seasons, but increasingly over time becoming critical in relation to the kinds of climate shocks that we see increasingly across the whole of India. Again, we've got really good evidence. So if you look at the report I mentioned earlier, it collects together some of the academic work that's coming out, demonstrating the importance of NREGA in sustaining consumption, protecting savings, improving health and education outcomes, but also really in improving community level natural resource management, contributing to climate adaptation, and really substantial contributions to climate mitigation as well, in terms of how that is translated into greater forest cover, for example. And there's other programs, I mean, the Productive Safety Net program in Ethiopia, which has similarly scale, really substantial contributions to that agenda. Next slide, please. And these two programs that I've covered here really, aren't designed primarily as climate programs. They are existing government programs that have been scaled up and that are increasingly responding to the climate risks that are being faced in those countries. Here is a slightly different example where it's the PROESA project in Paraguay, which is a green climate fund project where FAO are the executing entity. And here what we can see is we're combining an existing socially conditioned cash transfer called Tecapura in Paraguay with environmentally conditioned cash transfers that are connected to the sustainable management of forests in this context. It's also essentially a cash plus approach. So alongside those two different cash transfers, you have a set of complementary services. So that's training on sustainable agroforestry, the provision of inputs, the provision of other kind of livelihood services. So you've got basically a poverty-targeted cash transfer functioning alongside an environmentally conditioned cash transfer with a cash plus approach. Now, I said all sort of three have maybe missing elements. So PROESA, although this is actually a climate program, designed in from the start, it doesn't have a major shock responsive component at present. So this is, a cash transfer that is more focused explicitly on the longer term adaptation agenda. So in this particular context, it's in response to the increasing number of droughts in the areas that the project is working. So you've got three examples there where I think you can see at scale government systems really working to address different dimensions of the climate crisis, but perhaps none of them yet addressing all the different dimensions in one comprehensive program. Okay, next slide, please. And I wanted to give that last example from the Green Climate Fund because I think it is important. I mean, Anna gave the kind of broad context about what climate change is doing, but I think we also need to be thinking about, as I said, this kind of overarching set of climate actions. So this is under the UNFCCC processes, where at the last COP we can see increasingly social protection the role of social protection is becoming much better recognised. It was in the last IPCC 2022 report in numerous places, and we can see that the strategic work streams on adaptation, on just transitions, and also on the new loss and damage fund all recognise the role of social protection within that dimension of climate action, and then also important and related initiatives that some of you may be involved in or aware of, which, for example, the new Global Shield against climate risks. Okay, next slide, please. So just to say, we looked at this and tried to explore how existing climate funds were using social protection, and I think some of this is very relevant for those of you working, within the cash community. We looked at, we found 21 projects across the three funds, and mostly they were using cash transfers or cash for work components, alongside the use of social registries, alongside complementary services. So in terms of the funds the projects that are being funded under UNFCCC funds, we can see that cash is a kind of core approach. There was in terms of the inclusion agenda, we could see that they were trying to incorporate gender sensitivity into those programs, but much less on the inclusion of other vulnerable groups. So here we might be thinking about migrants. This is a really important group to think about in relation to climate change, people with disabilities, youth and indigenous peoples. And one of the things that came out from this whole process is the absolutely critical importance of cross-sectoral collaboration in relation to these projects. So this would be, yes, governments, but different elements of government. So there we're talking about agriculture, social protection, disaster risk reduction, environment. So bringing those different components of government together, but also different partners. So the projects that we've got here were implemented by a whole range of different entities, including UN agencies, but also other NGOs, so Save the Children, for example, and Conservation International. So we've got a whole range of different partners kind of working together with government in these contexts. Okay, next slide, please. I mean, I won't spend long on this, it's just to give an example, just to show that these projects are spread kind of globally. Next slide, please. Okay, only 2 slides to go. So firstly, so this cross-collaboration being critically important. And I think the other message, if I could put a core message forward, is the importance of the system strengthening elements to respond to these long-term needs, these long-term trends that Anna was talking about at the start of the presentation. So ProASA I've already given as an example of a kind of system strengthening component, a project. Another example would be in Botswana, where they're using a government cash for work program to do ecosystem restoration. And then the third one that I think is particularly relevant here is in Vanuatu to establish a shock responsive cash transfer. Now, this is implemented by Save the Children in Vanuatu, and it's got an explicit focus, for example, on people with disabilities, which is great to see. But perhaps missing, there's an adaptation component to this program where there isn't a link between the shock responsive component and the beneficiaries of this and the adaptation component and the beneficiaries of that. And it's precisely those kind of linkages that I think are critical going forward. But I mean, just one further thing before I move to the last slide is hot off the press. So Save the Children have just had another project approved in this week by GCF in Mozambique, called Building Climate Resilience through linking climate adaptation and social protection through decentralized planning, £28 million project, where there is precisely that link. So you've got the use of government public works programs in the country, you've got the links to local government programs, you've got the links to the inclusion of people with disabilities, and the shock responsive elements all within one program. So I think we can have a lot of ambition about how we do these kinds of programs going forward, and it's great to see that this new program, maybe ticks more of those boxes than some of the existing programs that I've been looking at. Final slide. Okay, so just to finish off with some key messages. As I said, I think this issue about the medium long-term perspective being really absolutely essential. So the role, and then in that perspective, the role of CVA and shock responsive social protection in connecting with and responding to climate adaptation, a focus on strengthening government systems and involving a wide range of partners in doing that. And the importance of cross-sectoral collaboration. So not just thinking about social protection or DIR, but also the agriculture sector, the environment sector, and obviously the kind of finance issue. And then I think throughout, I would suggest that there's a stronger, that there's room for a much more ambitious agenda on the inclusion of vulnerable groups within social protection programs and potentially within CVA programming that's responding directly to the climate crisis. Okay, I'll finish there.
Thank you so much, Matthew, but also thank you, Sayanti and Anna. It was amazing how clear it is about how urgent and massive the change will be, but also it was not so depressing because you give us a lot of things we can do and how we can act. And I think it's super important for us to continue that discussion now. So it's great to have you on the panel to discuss it further. So please continue to ask your question. Please use the Q&A box so it's easier for us to follow. Also go back in the chat to see all the presentation shared and also all the link to important documents there. I'm also really super happy to present you 2 other panelists who are joining us today. So we have Annalisa Staffa, who hold a PhD in political study from the University of Milan in Italy, a master in public policy analysis from the University of Turin, a master in methodology and empirical research in the social science at the University of Florence. She has worked with public administration, university, United Nations, and NGO in America, Europe, and Asia. She has been a lecturer in social policy design and evaluation and has worked as an independent evaluator of program and project and in processes of organizational development, research capacity building, evaluation monitoring with a social justice approach. She is currently director of the socio-economic analysis at UABN in the Dominican Republic. And we have her with her today also to join the panel discussion. Annalisa, feel free to start also your video so everyone can see you. Maybe Rowena, you can get rid of the presentation so we can see everyone in our screen. And we also have today with us Elisa Savelli, who is an experienced water security advisor, practitioner and academic in the water sector, specialized in the nexus between water, politics, and climate change. Elisa holds a PhD in environmental analysis from the University of Uppsala in Sweden, an MLC in water resource management from UNESCO Institute for Water Education in the Netherlands, and a Master of Engineering and Engineering Management from Bologna University in Italy. Elisa advises organizations on navigating water security, water governance, climate resilience and adaptation, water development, and humanitarian assistance. She is currently Water and Climate Advisor for the MENA and Europe region at Mercy Corp. And since 2023, she is co-leading of Future Med Cost Action, a European transdisciplinary network on climate adaptation decision and support tool. So welcome, Annalisa and Elisa, and great to still have you, Anna, Sayanti, and Matthew. So maybe to start the panel discussion, I will give the floor first to Annalisa, asking you, what are the main forcing challenge arising for the climate crisis with regard to social protection, mostly for you, but also all the humanitarian response? And maybe can you give us some example and recommendation from where you work for plan and action to help adapt or mitigate this challenge? And also if you can focus a bit on the CVA.
Yes, thank you, Celine, for your introduction. And definitely when Dr. Anna McCord was talking, I was just mentally doing some checklist in my head. And I was like, yes, we are facing that. Yes, we are facing unpredictability. Yes, we are facing a budget constraints. Yes, we are facing problem with infrastructure. And mentally I was like, yeah, definitely we are having, all those type of problems. I mean, for us mainly, like the main challenge for us right now is the unpredictability of the events and the type of the events. So just to give you an example, a few years ago, we would have to prepare for the hurricane season that usually went from the beginning of June to the end of October, more or less. But right now, the main problem that we have is that basically all year round, we have to be really prepared, especially for floods that have not been predicted, that we cannot have any type of forecast. And in 3-4 hours, we have, for example, the amount of rain that would be covered probably in 6 months, right? Especially in the city. So what does it mean for us, right, at the government level? What are the action that we are taking? This means that we really need to have an approach that has basically 24/7. We have to be ready. We have to be able to budget the money, and we have to really need to be able to have an emergency fund. And at the same time, when a flood is happening, I don't know, in February, we have really need to ask the question, okay, is right now we want to spend, we are just in February, we have other 10 more months to go. Do we want to spend the money here? How do we administer? How do we prioritize this budget that we have? So this is like a huge problem that a huge challenge that that we are facing. So the ability to administer these scarce resources is absolutely critical for us. So how do we intervene? How do we administer the emergency budget? It's one of the things that we are constantly facing. The second main challenge for us is that government norms and budgeting structure is extremely is prepared basically for a very well administered plan during the year, right? But when we have emergency all the year around, it's very difficult for us to release those resources in a very rapid way. So especially when we are talking about emergency anticipatory action, we need a fast release in order to immediately activate our social protection protocols for emergency, and this has been one of the main challenges. So apart from this problem, what are we doing, right, to face this challenging? So of course we are aware there are many more challenges in this sector, but in order to mitigate this, what we are working on advocating in different spaces for the needs of releasing the fund during an emergency, during our government meeting, especially through official channels and with one-on-one meeting with key actors. We are working with emergency decree that give us more flexibility on releasing of funds. And this is, of course, is not sufficient many times because it's not only important that the money is released in a rapid way, it's also important that the money is distributed in a way in the planning process for an emergency, and in the way how this money has been distributed, which line of budget this money has been released, is extremely important, that the precision on how the release of budget is given to our agency and our institution. So it's not only important that it's rapid, but it's also important that the right line of the budget are targeted. And the other thing is that the emergency resolution the emergency decree that we work on, it's always gives us some flexibility for us to adapt and in a way to make sure that we can allocate resources and that we can evaluate the damages with a bit more flexibility so that we can respond to the unpredictability of this type of events. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Annalisa. So definitely I hear a lot about flexibility, but also resources and how to adapt quickly and timely, obviously, to that. But I also hear a bit about the collaboration that you are speaking between inside the government, but also with all the other actors as a key point there. Elisa, maybe I give you the floor also to try to unpack that a bit more on the same question.
Yes, why not? I would like to talk or at least to start with an example, because here we are talking about these unforeseen challenges resulting from climate change. And I would like to quote a very, very good recent Oxfam report, and the quote from Hassan Mohammed, a displaced father in Somalia, who's saying, "I lost all my animals due to the drought. I fled on foot with my children, and it took me 3 days to get to Baidoa. It was a difficult journey. I had no food or water for my children. Some got sick along the way." And also, Ashgor Kha, who live in a village of Saktira in Bangladesh, say, "We have lost our homes 4 times due to cyclones. We are still in debt for having taken a house loan. Our son is our only earning member, but he struggles to find any work in the area." So with these 2 quotes, I think that I don't have to say anything else to explain what does climate change mean? And what do we have to do what do we have to think about when we think about social protection or cash? We have to think about creating a safety net that helps the most vulnerable individual to face this vulnerability that becomes almost chronic, that they are and that ad hoc cash assistance will never be able to face or to support. So we have to think, as Matthew was saying, we have to think long term. We have to think about, I'm talking from a community perspective, all right? I didn't say that at the beginning, but I guess you have noticed. So we have to think long term. We have to think about increasing vulnerability or compounded vulnerability that start from gender, religious, race, and other basic vulnerability, and get compounded by in environmental injustices, and get compounded by climate injustices and socioeconomic injustices and climate injustices. So it becomes something that community cannot face by themselves, not maybe in a lifetime. Therefore, there needs to be some long-term support for these people, for this community.
Thank you so much, Liz. I think I don't have to wrap up, but definitely long-term and getting most vulnerable that we have to consider more and more. Anna, I see you nodded quite a lot of time. Do you want to react and complement maybe the thinking of the first question? Sorry, you're on mute, Anna.
I'm sorry, Celine, did you want to, could you reiterate the question?
Yes, please. So the question was, what are the main forcing challenges arising from the climate crisis with regard to social protection and or humanitarian response? And do you have example of recommendation for us to plan and act to help adapt on the mitigation of the challenge?
I mean, I think I'll just make a few reflections. I mean, the one issue is that we have to think of the role of CVA in the broader context of the climate crisis. So, for example, the role of a cash transfer or a voucher may change quite profoundly if we don't have access to food, or if there's a problem of water scarcity. There's a problem of cash and voucher assistance, which might help people to re-establish their livelihoods in areas which, as Annalisa said, maybe they're going to be affected by cyclones repeatedly. So there are real questions about the way that the kind of instruments that we use and how we might have to rethink them in the context of climate change, because CVA, which is effective in a pre-climate change context, may not be as effective if we're looking at all that whole range of human systems which are affected. And so and equally, helping people to reconstruct houses in locations where we know they're liable to be destroyed in the next year, that also raises questions. Perhaps then we need to be looking at issues of population movement, helping people resettle elsewhere. So some of the assumptions we've made about returning people to the status quo ante through a cash and voucher intervention may no longer be the right kind of assumptions to make in the context of climate change. So that would be my observation. Thank you, Celine.
Yeah, thank you for that. We see a lot of reaction on that. So maybe we'll reshuffle a bit the question for the panel and maybe ask Matthew and Tayanti to react a bit on that part, asking you maybe a question to frame that. So can humanitarian or CVA in general be designed to support and link to the longer term holistic approach to address the climate crisis? And for that, what need to be in place to open it effectively? And yeah, I know that you already, both of you, give quite a lot of example, but if you have some other in mind, please also share with us. So maybe Matthew first and then Tayanti to continue.
Yeah, I mean, the answer would be, I think it's really important that we bring these different stakeholders and actors together. It'll look different in different contexts. So we're doing some work at the moment with UNICEF in the Eastern Caribbean. And, we know the kinds of huge vulnerabilities that those islands have. And, we've seen an example already this hurricane season. And there, the kind of landscape of partners is quite different to if you're working in Sub-Saharan Africa or in Asia. But critically, you need to see the government entities, the UN agencies, but also the NGOs and other stakeholders who are working on the ground, all coming together in immediate shock response. But then I think, talking to, say, we brought together permanent secretaries from ministries of social development there, and they can see that the kinds of work that they're doing just gets sort of wiped out by these kind of crises, and that they don't just want to be treading water, they want to be thinking about how do we build longer term adaptation and resilience in that context. And it's a start of a journey for them. So, linking with the ministries of environment in that sector, but also linking with humanitarian actors and partners to think about how we do that better. It's not easy. I don't think, I don't have any, straightforward, silver bullets. But I think, it seems to me the climate crisis, as Anna said, and as everybody is reflecting on, is here with us for the remainder of our lives, and for the remainder of everybody who's on the planet currently. And if there's ever a case for this kind of attempts to do this longer term thinking and bridge this humanitarian and development divide, I think the climate crisis is the most important of those challenges that we need to really address. Sandy, I don't know if you've got anything.
Yeah, maybe just to add, I think very practically speaking, like it or not, cash is here to stay in some ways, because many countries, many actors still prefer distribution of cash, be it through social protection as a cash transfer, social assistance. These are the main programs we have also seen during COVID. And in terms of humanitarian crisis, we are also seeing cash being used continuously, as well as in anticipatory action. But given the uncertain nature that we are facing, and given that we are saying that we are going to have more of these risks that are unpredictable, affecting more number of people, different geographies, and so on, I think it's also important for humanitarian sectors, as in collaboration with the social protection sector, to revisit how cash is given. And this also extends to not just cash support, voucher as well. The whole shift towards digital cash transfers and mobile wallets, and this is something that will become more and more important if we are talking about, well, we need to build these infrastructure, and we are seeing this interoperability and this data sharing and these kind of things facilitating that conversation. But also some of the countries that I'm working with, there's a lot of interest in actually making digital cash accessible so that they can work in very short lead times when there is a hazard, or people can, and how can we connect this to social protection so that they can also do that as part of their system building approach itself. So I think in this community, this is something that we are exploring. We are often working with financial service providers at a smaller scale, but this needs to happen at a much larger scale. We are talking about making our systems flexible, and for compounding risks when we have this different risks in different parts of the region. So we are not just addressing one place, one time, but we might need to operate at different scales. So I think this digitalization aspect of it and working together with the national counterparts for this is something also that needs to be focused while we do all this coordination that Matthew was speaking about. Yeah.
Elisa, It's look like you want to step in. Please go ahead quickly.
No. Please continue with the. I was happy to hear what Sayanti said.
Okay, so it's some things that you definitely share. No, that's great. I think it's great to have all that discussion, etc. But we all acknowledge that climate change is increasing with frequency and intensity of shock in many places, which can further blur the line between acute and chronic ongoing impact. And it's what you prove a lot of time during the presentation and even during the discussion. So maybe Elisa, Annalisa, what do you see as the implication of this for the humanitarian response on the design, implementation, and the interplay with social protection? Do you say on that? Who want to start? Annalisa? Elisa, please go ahead.
Well, what I think is that yes, so this repeated, as I was saying before with the example, this repeated shock basically increase the existing vulnerability, create new vulnerability, and exacerbate the existing one. Okay, so you have this so it is harder to distinguish between what are the immediate the needs due to the crisis itself, or the needs to longer term needs that haven't been addressed before. So it's as if humanitarian response doesn't know whether to address the chronic or longer term needs or the crisis itself. So basically what humanitarian response can do, and here it's to look at the immediate needs, but the one that arise right after a crisis. But this humanitarian response need to be substantiated or supported by other types of response. And I'm not an expert or of cash or social protection, but I would say that in terms of vulnerability, we have to be able to address with different or as I said, enhanced response that are able also to face these longer term needs of this population. What I haven't talked about are the hazard itself, or why are we facing this vulnerability, this crisis? And this is maybe something we can discuss later. I would like to, maybe next, but let's first hear what Annalisa is saying and then go back to this point.
Well, that's a fantastic home run there from Elisa. I think that is a great introduction of what I wanted to say. What Elisa say, I think it's like the main problem that we are facing at the country level, because what happens is that, okay, this is like an immediate need. This one should be addressed by a policy, a more structured program. So that's one of the things that I think for us especially is one of the main implications. I mean, it's one of the main implications at the country and the government level, and is the necessity of continued coordination, training, knowing each other, knowing which are the lines, between what is humanitarian, what is, a more sustainable policy. And I think the continued coordination between humanitarian actors and social protection actors and all the actors involved in the different ministries is key for us. At least these are for us has been one of the main learning experiences. We keep saying in our reunion that social protection actors need to be trained in humanitarian emergency preparation, and that humanitarians and first responders needs to be trained in social protection and adaptive social protection, because all of these in the end should be seen as a integral system, right? And this for us is very important. We need to continuously think on an integral approach and policies, especially for the long run, like medium and long run, because right now, especially when we are very involved responding to continuous. Sometimes we have had, like a few months ago, we have had 5 events. Like my team was completely exhausted from going to the field to collect information. Like we couldn't deal anymore. Even human resources were extremely exhausted with, like, you're at a certain point where you really need to think, okay, how we are doing, and what we are doing to prevent this type of climate shock. I mean, for us, okay, we are involved, we are extremely active, etc. But how do we deal with that, right? Even human, like first responders and people that are in social adaptive protection system, we are sometimes like exhausted from all these events. What were you doing, right? So I think we also need to think about that. We arrive at a crisis point. I don't think it's very far. We are already we're already responding 5, 6, 7 events in a month in different places in the island for us. So I think we are continuously challenged to think about an integral approach, and we really need to think about us in social protection, that we are just a piece of the puzzle, right? We really need to be aware that without the help of and without the contribution of the other policies, is not possible, like, right, to keep this ongoing crisis. Like, it's a continuous state of crisis, especially for us in the Caribbean, that we are so continuously hit by different types of phenomena. Is becoming like extremely, it's not in 10 years. Like, I always laugh when I see that, oh, like in 2015 and 2013, like it's here. Like literally we are dealing with that every day on a small scale, on a bigger scale, but we are constantly responding. And so the first thing is this, to see our social protection system as a whole, and not as, like, okay, we are responding and then I'm just forget about, all the other actors. The second thing is about how we are not overlapping actions with different agents. We are not exactly first respondent, but we are adaptive social protection systems. So how do we, so I respect what the first responders are doing, but as soon as they go out from the field, I need to enter to collect information, to survey the damages and everything, so that we can have some type of support in different forms. Sometimes it can be cash, sometimes it's in kind, as you know, and everything. But we really need to think about what we are doing, right? And the other thing is how we complement the instruments, because cash transfer at the government level is extremely expensive sometimes, especially for bigger events. So how do we complement also with insurance, like small insurance, with pool insurance at the government level, but into an integral pool of different countries, right? Everything related with prevention. We know that prevention is way, and adaptive also policy are way cheaper than intervening when you already have a flood, right? In 10, 15 municipality. So what are we doing, to prevent that? So I think for us is like not only thinking about one instrument, thinking about the integration of policy, but also thinking the integration of different type of instruments, so that the long-term goal is that we shouldn't be necessary, right? If we have strong prevention, if we have a good first respondents, and the community is able to respond immediately to the challenges that are happening, we should be obsolete, right? And that should be our goal in the long run, right? In the meanwhile, we are trying to basically, let's say, put a patch, right? But not solving any problem. We are just kind of rushing, like trying to help that person that has been displaced, for example. But the main thing is that person should have never been allowed to be displaced, right? So it's something that thinking integral, like thinking in a more holistic sense and more policy oriented in the long run, should be like the goal in this sense. And I think that's what we are trying to achieve, right? What we are trying to work on, because we are very aware that this is not sustainable, and that the climate crisis is here. It's not coming, like it's here. Like winter is coming, it's not like winter is here right now. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I think Anna quickly and Matthew quickly to react to all that, but it was quite amazing. Thank you, Anna-Lisa, for that.
Yeah, it was. And I think all of us listening, Annalisa, we're all with you, and we're all sympathetic and thinking what a marvelous job you're doing. And yeah, it sounds really hard. A couple of observations. I don't think you'll ever be obsolete. I think these challenges are bigger than us, and these climate challenges are going to continue. So the question is, how do we cope with them? And in fact, so many development indicators are going backwards in the face of climate change. So I think it's really important to be realistic about that. But I think what you're experiencing is what we are all going to be experiencing in our nation states. You're a kind of vanguard state. In Asia, you've got the Pacific who are already experiencing what the rest of Asia are going to experience. And I think there's a great deal to learn from the kind of challenges you're facing. So I think that would be really useful to know more about that. But just a couple of things. I mean, you spoke about the difficulty of going in and doing assessments. So maybe we need to think, well, how do we do that differently? Because certain approaches which we've been using for years may not be viable in the longer term. You can't go out every week and do assessments. Maybe we need to think about different kinds of targeting, much more geographical targeting. These kind of things may be important. Similarly, we need to be thinking about mandates. How efficient is it to have these different institutions with mandates which are perhaps becoming increasingly close and intertwined as the context change? Maybe it's time for us to start thinking about these more fundamental questions about the institutions we have so that we can streamline things. Similarly, there's a question, you were talking about the role of insurance. This is a really interesting one. Shayanti and I have been talking about this, thinking about this a lot. What's the role of insurance in a context when the shocks are becoming more and more frequent, more severe? So actually, some of the tools that we turn to, the approaches that we're using, maybe we actually have to start rethinking some of these in the context of climate change. And I think you just illustrated these dilemmas and the things that we need to start reconceptualizing really clearly, Annalisa. Just good luck with it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. And yeah, so I mean, speaking to something slightly different in terms of this kind of longer term policy agenda that you're talking about and the strategic linkages and all of this, which I sort of, obviously spoke to in my presentation. Something that's quite specific that I'd be interested, I mean, Annalisa, in your reflection, but also I think for the group as a whole. So at the moment, the nationally determined contributions are being done, globally for every country, and it's the key strategic document that frames kind of climate action. I mean, mitigation goals, yes, but also adaptation and all of these other. It's the key strategic document for each country. So it would be interesting, Annalisa, to know the extent to which you said you were linking humanitarian and social protection sectors, but with I assume it's the Ministry of Environment. The engagement with that process, and then also more broadly for humanitarian actors as a whole. The extent to which people are engaging in this process going forward. We're trying to support, social protection ministries, social protection stakeholders to do this. So Shayanti and I are both co-chairs of the Universal Social Protection 2030 Working Group on Social Protection and Climate Change, which anybody who's really interested in carrying on these discussions, please come join us in that group. It's open to all. But I mean, it's really to kind of A, flag that process up, B, maybe hear Annalisa's reflections a bit, but I think there you can see a context where it's social protection kind of coming in, presumably also the humanitarian actors coming in, and it's really the environment ministries that have had the kind of lead role in this up till now. And it's, I think it's a really critical agenda going forward.
Yes, thank you. And I'm sorry, I will need to cut this panel short, even if I want to stay with all of you forever to learn more about all that. I have to ask to the audience, please let us know in the chat which topic you would like for us to have in a future webinar for the community of practice. And by the time you're answering that, I will ask a very final bit of question to all the panelists, and please keep your answers super short. So yes, definitely, Anna, the question is how to cope with all that. Do you have any idea, opportunity, enabler, action that you can think about for us to begin to plan, act on something, especially to making sure that we assist properly the most vulnerable and the population that is impacted by the climate crisis. I don't know who wants to go first. Elisa, your mic is.
I've been thinking throughout this panel and also before when you asked me what can cash or humanitarian assistance do? Cash and other humanitarian assistance can address, as I said, the symptom of this crisis by providing access to any type of resources, protection to avoid additional or face further risk, can reduce some vulnerability, can empower by empowering community through capacity strengthening and other activity. But what is missing with the humanitarian perspective is the tackling the root causes of the crisis, the reason why those marginalized people are facing this crisis, the reason why we are facing the crisis, it's the climate crisis itself. So we have to think about wealth redistribution. We have to think about redistribution of responsibility. The one that caused the example of like Mohammed and Ashgor, the example I gave in the first place, to be so vulnerable, are not paying for this crisis. The one that are paying are the one that didn't cause this crisis. So I think that we really have to think about redistribution of wealth, redistribution of the responsibility, with maybe asking the nation or the people that are responsible for this to pay by providing funding, by paying fees, by injecting funding to this loss and damage scheme or to other scheme that can support these. And I'm not talking about, I'm talking about substantial wealth redistribution. And yes, sorry, I'll stop here.
Thank you so much. Anyone to go next? I know that it's a big question. Yes, please.
I'm happy to go next, Celine, because we are already above time. I just think, as Annalisa was speaking, we have this humanitarian actors, we have the social protection actors, and we are reaching our limits. I think we need to work with communities more. We always talk about the localization agenda, and we're always talking about, like, let's make these connections with our communities. But in some of these Pacific countries that I've been working with, community leaders, youth representatives, they have been working fantastic as early warning system providers in their own communities for ages. And we need to leverage the systems, give them the possibility, training, technical capacity, and all of these resources to make that happen and work with us. So I think this link is often not done, and there's a lot of potential in there. So this is something we should look into more. Thanks, and over.
Thank you so much. A last word, Annalisa, or feel free to decline.
I really like if you don't want to redistribute, I think you need to redistribute responsibility. I think I'm going to tattoo that on my, I don't know, one of my arms. I think it's super important that I really like that. I think in each space that we are working on, I think the first thing for us is coordination. And I think it should be vertical, but at the same time, also in a vertical level, but also in the horizontal level, in the sense that community leaders, government, NGOs, and everything. I mean, we should be all part of the same task force, right? I think one of the main learning that we have had at the Dominican level was the opportunity to work in a task force for social protection. And we have been able to involve the humanitarian, the NGOs, the international organizations, different government agency. And I think this for us has been I don't know, game changing really in terms of learning, but also in terms of using better our resources and to arrive to like even the smallest, corner, because we are always receiving and information. And in this sense, information is power. If you have this type of information, you can also reach out depending on the type of event, right? So I mean, there is so much to think about. I'm just living with more questions than answer, and how we can also improve. So yeah, thank you, to all the panelists, really.
Yeah, I'm sorry, we are over time already. So I really want to thank you for the presentation, which were amazing. We have a lot of persons that really enjoyed that. We see that in the chat, in the Q&A. And yeah, even if I've seen your presentation before, it was so enlightening. Thank you for the panel discussion. It was so lively and having a lot of ideas that we share together. It's quite amazing. We are on the same page on something. We are still have a lot to react and think all together. So thank you for all that. For the audience, the recording will be available in the website by the end of the month. All the presentation will be also translated in French and Spanish and available in that language. Unfortunately, not the panel discussion, but we will try to make some notes to try to highlight the most important point, which will be very difficult because it was really rich. So thank you all for that. For the one who are not based in America and want to wake up very early, if you are in Europe or Africa, or if you have some friend in Asia, we have another webinar on Tuesday, 23rd, morning for Europe, afternoon for Asia. So please go on the website and register. I'll share that widely. It will be great. Ruth, do you want to close it?
I think you've covered it really effectively. Yeah, thanks so much to all of our presenters and panelists, to everyone that joined. Yeah, it's been brilliant. Hope to catch you again sometime soon. Take good care. Enjoy your summers.
Thanks, Ruth.
Thank you
Thanks,
so much.
Celine. Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Bye.